I feel like I am clear.
I think I have seconds.
Pretend like you're having fun. And don't forget to remember that there's a third person watching us at camera, so be looking at the camera. Hi, I'm Jack ReVelle, and this is Continuous Improvement. This is our third show in the series, and today we have a special guest with us, Gregory H. Watson. Greg is going to be talking to us about a dual role application for benchmarking as a management practice and a quality practice. Before I introduce you to Greg, let's just review where we've been and where we're going. In our first two telecasts, we had Mike Broussard from Gold QPC talking to us about the 7 management and planning tools. And then last month we had Pat Riley, the founder and chairman emeritus of the Council for Continuous Improvement, talking about the council as a basis for a national learning environment. Greg will be talking to us today about benchmarking, as I've already mentioned. Next month we have another really unusual guest, a gentleman who is truly a legend in the area of design of experiments using what he calls statistical engineering. We'll be talking to Mr. Dorian Shainin. And in November we'll be talking to Dr. George Labovitz, the founder of Organizational Dynamics Incorporated, ODI. George is also a professor of business, professor of management at Boston University in the Boston area. Which brings me to mentioning where we are. You know where you are, but you may not know where Greg and I are today. And where we are is Northeastern University in the downtown Boston area. Last month we did our telecast from the University of Arizona in Tucson. The previous month we did it from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. In subsequent months we'll be back at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and back here to Northeastern. And as we get into our telecast next year, we'll be at the University of Wisconsin, we'll be at the University of Michigan, and we are going all over the country to find you the very best in the leading, most knowledgeable specialists in the area of continuous improvement and total quality management to help you, the practitioner, the participant, to become more and more familiar with all the various aspects of continuous improvement. And having said all that, let me now introduce my guest, Greg Watson. Greg and I have been, I'd like to say, more than friendly. We've been friends since 1988 when we first met as members of the research committee at Goal QPC in the Methuen, Massachusetts area. If you're not familiar with Goal from our first telecast, when Mike Broussard was on, Goal is one of the 2 leading nonprofit TQM cutting-edge organizations in the United States, specializing in the various tools and concepts and techniques of total quality management. They are pioneers in the area of quality function deployment, policy deployment, TQM tools and culture, and in general a fine organization. And Greg and I had the opportunity to meet and become friendly and exchange ideas and find some of the common things that we had interest in. At that time, Greg was a part of the Hewlett-Packard organization in California. He subsequently, as he moved up in his career, became a member of the Compact organization. He was part of the Benchmarking Clearinghouse in Houston, Texas. I'll tell you more about that in a little while. And finally, his most recent position before leaving it just a few months ago was as Vice President of Xerox Learning Solutions. Is that right?
It's Xerox Quality Solutions.
Xerox Quality Solutions in Rochester, New York. Since June of this year, Greg has been out on his own as a managing partner in what we call Business Systems Solutions. Greg is the author of a number of books on the subject of benchmarking, the Benchmarking Workbook, the Benchmarking Management Guide, Strategic Benchmarking from John Wiley. We'll be talking about that, and Greg's new book on business systems engineering later on in this telecast. By way of background, you might be interested to know that Greg has a BA in liberal arts from Taylor University in central Indiana, 2 masters, one in systems engineering from USC, University of Southern California, in my town, Los Angeles. He has an MA in legal studies from Antioch University. You've got to be careful when a man has a background in law and systems engineering. He's a certified quality engineer from the American Society for Quality Control and a senior member of ASQC. And speaking of ASQC, Greg is also a member of the board of directors of the American Society for Quality Control. what can I say? As I mentioned, he's already now a managing partner in Business System Solutions, an international consulting organization that is headquartered in Victor, New York, right outside of Rochester, New York, my hometown. Enough background on Greg. We're here to talk about benchmarking today. Benchmarking is an integral part of total quality management and continuous improvement, and we're going to try and probe as deeply as we can into Greg's knowledge and understanding as a pioneer in the benchmarking area. So with that, I'm going to turn to Greg and say, think back to a number of years ago when you first heard the term benchmarking in the way that we are using it today. When was that? What were the circumstances, and what was your reaction to it?
Well, Jack, it was about in 1984, and I was a procurement engineer at Hewlett-Packard. I was assigned in the research lab at San Diego division, which is hard copy graphics. And in that function, we were working on what we would call today work process simplification or re-engineering, and we wanted to streamline the supplier procurement process in the research and development lab. And as an additional duty to my normal responsibilities, I was asked to find out what indeed could we do to improve the process. Starting off, I was reading in Purchasing Magazine and found out that Xerox Corporation had just won the purchasing medal from the National Association of Purchasing Management, or Purchasing Magazine, I guess. And I decided that I'd give them a call up in El Segundo, California, again, your old territory in L.A., and find out. And I ended up going up there and meeting Jules Couchot and Jack Kelly and
Did you happen to
John Mitchell.
Ken Farrell by any chance?
I met him later.
Okay.
Yeah. And those three gentlemen introduced me to benchmarking. And
what year was this now?
This is 1984.
So 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Wow.
And they called it competitive benchmarking. Jules was in the process, he was a training manager, was in the process of developing the first course on that. And they had just come out with the Red Book on benchmarking to describe what it was. And they had a firm process now. So they put me through the pilot of the course and became one of the first outside people to learn about it.
What was your reaction to the concepts that they offered to you?
It was interesting because I think the first thing I thought was, this is common sense. And a lot of times when I'm asked to define benchmarking, I really think of it as applied common sense. Why should we try to relearn lessons other people have learned? Why don't we learn from their mistakes, learn from things that went well or bad, and improve our own processes as a result of it? And it just made a lot of sense to me when they explained what it was about and how it could be helpful. I saw the evidence that they presented on the turnaround of the Xerox manufacturing systems and how benchmarking had played a role as a key tool in helping them to understand not only the need to turn around, but also the lessons that they might be able to use on how to turn the company around.
Now, out of curiosity, well, I would say probably more for our viewers who've heard the term benchmarking, but never studied it, read about it, and there are still many people like that, believe it or not. Would you give us a kind of a working definition, a generic definition of benchmarking? What is it?
You know, it's interesting you ask this question because I've gotten so familiar with the term over the years that I keep thinking that everybody knows what it is.
I assure you, from personal experience, not everybody knows what it is.
Well, I was just in Chile last month, and I found out that benchmarking has no translation into Spanish. And so I had to go through the whole etymology for them. And it's interesting, the word really is derived from a surveyor's mark or a benchmark, which is a reference point from a known location from which you measure on where you're going to go. And so really a benchmark is a measurement, first of all, that tells you where you are relative to a known standard. And in business improvement, we want that to be a standard of excellence. So we're looking at a reference where we stand relative to a standard of excellence. And then we're trying to find out how to improve. So what we're looking for then are lessons. So it's really part of a learning experience as well. So in benchmarking, we're looking to find out where we stand and then what lessons the other organization who's improved better than we have, what have they done that has allowed them to have the progress that they've made and that we might be able to then adapt and bring inside to our own organization to apply as well.
You know, I want to ask you about some of the advantages of doing benchmarking, but before I do, when you were in Chile, and I assume that they speak either Spanish or Portuguese down there. What word did you ultimately come up with that was established as the word for benchmarking?
Benchmarking.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
They used the English word.
They use the English word, and as a matter of fact, I was quite glad they did, because when I was listening to the simultaneous translation, I could then follow it. My strategic benchmarking book has been translated into German, and the title is Benchmarking vom besten Lernen. And so that's benchmarking for better learning. And so each of the languages it's being translated in is being carried forth as benchmarking. I'm not sure the Japanese translation may be different.
I'll bet what it is benchmarking. Now, the reason I say that, I lived over in Japan for 4 years, and I discovered a lot of the newer technical words they took directly from the English. For example, the word for antenna is antenna, and the word for Christmas is Christmas. So I wouldn't be a bit surprised if they call it benchmarking in Japan as well.
Well, there's really a sort of a practical definition for benchmarking, which I've seen written, and I really like it because it speaks to the common sense side of it. That benchmarking is really being humble enough to know that somebody else is doing something better,
and willing to admit it.
To admit it,
yes.
Exactly.
Talk about some of the advantages for us. What are some of the advantages of doing benchmarking?
Well, in reality, the biggest advantage is it allows you to make time-focused changes and make the change happen quicker. And you can make change happen in an organization through benchmarking really at 2 levels. You can do it strategically, where you're talking about changing the way the whole organization is functioning, or you can do it at an operational level, where you're talking about changing the way a specific work process is functioning. So either way, and what it really does is it collapses the amount of time. Now, today we're worried in business about doing things quicker, doing it better.
Cycle time, kind of.
Right. And so this is the cycle time of making change happen in an organization. Not having to work all the experiments, not having to learn all the lessons by going through and experiencing directly the change in the change process.
It would seem to me, for example, in a process, if we were doing some kind of technical benchmarking on a process, that by using the benchmarking standards established by other organizations that were doing similar work, that you'll be able to set stretch goals for your organization that you might not have set otherwise. You might be going along at a particular parts per million defect rate, and you say, well, we're going to try and reduce that within a year by 20 or 30%, and then you find out that somebody in some other industry that's doing the same kind of thing set a goal and was able to reduce it by 200%. And it's something that you would never even have conceived of considering if you had not used benchmarking.
Well, you said 3 very important things in that summary.
That's probably 3 more than I've ever said in my whole life.
Oh, I know better. But it's interesting. You mentioned technical process benchmarking. Really, you can benchmark products, services, processes, management practices. You can look at a whole lot of things. It's really the same study process that you'd apply for any one of them. In addition, the second thing you were talking about was a similar business. And it's really key in benchmarking to build what I usually refer to as an analogy. How like us is this organization that we're going to take a look at? What are the factors? And there are 2 different types of factors we look at. The business model they're in, what sort of things are important to their business, and then the cultural side in terms of how does that organization actually work? Are they an authoritarian?
Their culture, kind of.
Exactly, the cultural issues. And so those things can make a big difference, and they help you to interpret how do we change that lesson we learned at this organization into our own.
Hey, now, something you just said tells me that you don't have to be a TQM-driven organization to use benchmarking. Because if you can be an authoritarian organization, which is obviously the antithesis of total quality management, and still be using benchmarking. Benchmarking then is not reserved to an organization that considers itself to be a TQM-driven or organized along TQM lines kind of organization. Any organization, no matter what their culture, if they're willing to accept the fact that some other organization may be doing something that they're doing, but doing it much better or much faster or with better quality, that they can use benchmarking. Is that true?
Well, that's true. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at the process for benchmarking, when you encapsulate the whole thing, if you implement benchmarking and you've never done a thing with total quality management, one of the things you'll find is that you learn the tools of TQM as you go through the process. You learn how to do process mapping, you learn how to measure, you learn how to work in teams. As a matter of fact, at Xerox, benchmarking preceded their TQM efforts by about 4 years. And so that it was really a tool that helped change the business. So it's a business practices tool focused. And at the same time, it helped them to set some stretch goals, which was the third point you'd mentioned earlier. And one of the things that benchmarking does, it allows you to see an organization that's just so far exceeded you. I think the story that Xerox came out with originally in their 1983 discovery of their position relative to the Japanese, they found out that the Japanese were actually building products and selling them at the price that they could afford to build them at. So the internal manufacturing cost for Xerox was equal to the street sales price of their Japanese competitors.
Yeah, I've heard Dave Kern talk about that in
Not a
speech.
good situation to be in business.
No.
And so what they had found was there was a need for a stretch goal. And then they asked the deeper question, why are they able to do that? And through this, they found the discovery that Xerox had been going along for years in business as usual. They had identified a product, they had a technology that was leading, and when other competitors came along with that technology, they didn't put it into the same manufacturing context and manufacturing process. The Japanese competitors, for instance, used the lessons learned from Toyota in just-in-time production, and they created a more efficient manufacturing and distribution system. So the focus in the benchmarking study said they're better. And then where are they better? They found that it was in manufacturing and distribution, and that then became the focus of a lot of the benchmarking studies to find out what could we do specifically to improve.
Fascinating. You know, I've heard the term in connection with benchmarking about a learning organization. Could you kind of connect the two for me? What role does benchmarking play in a learning organization?
Well, I think really Peter Senge from MIT here in Boston is the one who has popularized the phrase of the learning organization. And what Peter really is thinking about is that we take a systems approach to an organization. That is, we view all of the different processes in terms of how they interrelate. And in that particular viewpoint, an organization that continues to grow has to learn. And learning becomes a primary stimulus. What benchmarking does, and its contribution is that it's the vehicle for stimulating the organization to external change, because it brings those external changes into the organization that then allows it to grow.
You know, you're talking about learning organizations. The both of us having been at one time or another Baldrige examiners, Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. One of the statistics they taught us or provided to us while we were going through training for the Board of Examiners was that the average Baldrige winner, that their employees average about 5% of the work year in a training mode. Now you're talking about 250 working days a year times 8 hours a day. You're talking 2,000 hours. 5% of that is about 100 hours. And 100 hours, if my math serves me correctly, is about 2.5 weeks, 2.5 40-hour weeks. Now that means that the average Baldrige winner has their employees in a training mode of some kind or another for 2.5 weeks a year. Now that being the average, and both of us having pretty good background in statistics, that means that you've got some companies have employees that are 4 or 5 weeks, and some averaging perhaps only 1 or 2 weeks. Those companies, those organizations that want to be considered as leaders, world-class quality organizations, whether a university or a hospital or a financial institution or a manufacturing organization or an R&D organization, that do not recognize the importance of being a learning organization, it would seem to me, and I'd be interested in your reaction to this, are doomed ultimately to failure.
Well, I think you've got a great point there, because when I think of learning organizations, many people will just capsulize and focus on on-site training or on-the-job training. And there's a lot more to learning than just training. There's creating experiences, creating dialogues and discussions that are important. And really what benchmarking is doing is creating an intercorporate dialogue or an interrelationship among organizations that allows them to see what changes they can make for the future. So it's creating the groundwork for a different kind of learning from the classroom. And I think the excellent organizations, the ones that are pushing, if you will, that nebulous thing we call the world class, those organizations are finding unique ways to learn. whether it's through their computer systems and interactive learning. Benchmarking is another vehicle, as well as the on-site training. And they're using a lot of things together.
A good example would be this telecast. NTU's series of telecasts, not only of this series on continuous improvement, but on other various uplinks and downlinks that NTU gets involved in, I think would be a good example of how to expand your capability as a learning organization.
Exactly.
Let's go on, and we know that there's different kinds of benchmarking. We've mentioned that already. Could you give our viewers a kind of your perspective on process benchmarking?
Certainly. You know, in reality, I mentioned earlier that you can benchmark products, you can benchmark services, you can benchmark business practices, but the biggest payoff comes from what I call process benchmarking. And this is where we take a look at a business process or a work process we have in our organization, measure its performance, map it to understand how it works, and then compare that to organizations that are significantly better than we are. Now, this type of benchmarking can be performed in several different ways, and perhaps if we use a graphic to illustrate this.
Oh, graphics. Which reminds me, before you get into that, for those of you who are watching, if you have not received a set of 6, count them 6, that's like half a dozen hard copies that you would have in front of you, your coordinator, your downlink coordinator, wherever your downlink site is, whether you're at a university or at some other organization, should be contacting NTU and requesting a copy, because Greg provided these to NTU, and I'm a little bit concerned that some of the downlink sites may not have received these. So if you've got them, just ignore what I'm saying for the moment. If you've not received them, please contact the NTU coordinator, Dick Soderberg, who is responsible for this series, and make sure that you get a set of these for each of the participants. Okay. Having said that, let's go back to this, Greg.
Okay, in this matrix, there are really 2 different ways of looking at data. The first is in terms of looking at it in terms of the study applications. And there are 2 types of study applications. The first one we have is strategic. And here we're talking about things like process re-engineering, work redesign for cross-functional processes, restructuring an organization. An example of this type of study would be the study that Xerox conducted when they looked at other organizations that had decentralized. And about 3 years ago, they made a major restructuring of the organization to decentralize what had been basically a large functional organization. They looked at Hewlett-Packard, Procter & Gamble, AT&T, all of whom had preceded that, and they wanted to find out what factors for success do they need to put in place, and that was a strategic study. Operational studies tend to be studies that are conducted at the work process level. This is where we can actually observe the work that people are doing, the kinds of functions that are going on.
Give us a couple of quick examples of operations.
An example of this would be to take a look at how a sales process works when you're selling direct selling, for instance.
Okay, very basic kinds of things.
Yeah, basic process of so we might call it an atomic building block of the organization.
There you go, okay, yeah.
And another example would be how a manufacturing operation where you're loading printed circuit boards.
Or a wave solder operation.
Wave solder. Distribution, you might take a look at how your picking process works.
Employment. The employment process in HR.
Right. As a matter of fact, HR is famous for having done benchmarking for a very long time. It goes back to World War II, when they had a lot of wage and price control administration, and they wanted to take a look and say, how do we make sure people are doing the same work and getting paid the same amount of money? So they started doing comparative studies, which is a form of benchmarking.
Well, you're showing your age. You really remember that?
No,
or
no,
you
no.
Just,
I read about
your
it.
Your grandfather told you about it. Yeah, right. Okay, continue on, please.
Okay, so this is the application, either a strategic application across all the functional organizations or an operational within. The difference between these two really is that strategic benchmarking studies are commissioned by the senior management team, the top team, and the operations studies more by the process owners. Now, another way of looking at studies, which is the way Bob Camp originally described it in his 1989 book on benchmarking.
Yeah, that was the pioneering effort in published text.
That was the first published text, and actually Bob had written the first article in 1989, or maybe it was 87, in Harvard Business Review, a little short article with Cy Zivin and Oh, somebody else?
Someone else, no doubt.
And on benchmarking, that introduced the term in general. But they were talking about benchmarking studies relative to the sources of data. Where do you get the comparative information from? And they had 4 different types. A competitive study, and this would be, for instance, like when Xerox was doing the study against their Japanese competitors. An internal study is when you're taking a look at different organizations within the same corporation or the same organization that have similar functions. For instance, Hewlett-Packard in strategic benchmarking, there's a case study that talks about all of the R&D organizations that were making comparisons on their time to market and what processes did they do that would allow them to get to market quicker. The functional benchmarking, sometimes people will call this industry benchmarking, is where you're looking at the same function but within generally a non-competitive part of your industry. So you might be in the chemical industry, but you're looking at companies that are not head-to-head competitors.
Sure.
So you'll get more information, but they may be a little concerned that you might become a latent competitor. So it's not totally open. With competitive benchmarking, for instance, they're not going to be as open as you'd want, particularly on any process that they think leads them to competitive advantage. Sure. The internal benchmarking, you get complete openness, but you don't get any ideas that are, quote, out of the box, no real creativity. Now, the last type of benchmarking process or source of data is generic. And this is the example from Bob Camp's book where he's talking about looking at a distribution process at Xerox versus LL Bean. And here what you need to do is build the analogy. How do we learn from this very dissimilar business what we should be doing? And so we go out, we learn lessons. Now, in addition to LL Bean, Bob looked at Sears and the Limited and several other companies that are known for excellence in distribution. And Xerox took all those ideas, combined them together in what you might call creative imitation, and then with a spark of innovation said, this is what we ought to do now for our business based on the kinds of analogies between their business models and cultures and our own.
You know, coming back for just a second to the differentiating between strategic and operational benchmarking, I'm aware of an organization, a major company as a matter of fact, that does not use the term strategic benchmarking. Rather, they use the term bench trending. And basically, it's the same kind of thing that you were talking about when you talk about strategic benchmarking, not only here, but in your Wiley book that came out last year. In fact, why don't you hold that up so the folks, or just put it on there so people can see it. This is Greg's book, came out last year, Strategic Benchmarking, published by Wiley, copyright 93. You've got another book coming out this year too, don't you?
Yes.
Is that, no, that's it over there. Yeah, why don't you put that up so people can see it? Yeah, this is Greg's new book, Business Systems Engineering, Managing Breakthrough Changes for Productivity and Profit. When will this be available to the public?
This is going to be on the press or in distribution on November 1st.
Let's see, and this is September, so about 60 days.
Right.
Okay.
Right. It may be out a little bit before then.
Okay.
In some of the bookstores.
Okay, and that first book, if I recall, wasn't that an alternate book of the month selection by the Fortune Book Club? Yes,
it's actually done very well. I've been quite pleased with it. Fortune picked it up as an alternate for Book of the Month a summer ago. It's also been translated now into 7 languages. Japan is the latest, which I'm the most pleased about. Tony Kobayashi, the president of Fuji Xerox, wrote an afterwards because they read the books from the back to the front. Did you do the translation? No, they did it in Japan. Diamond Publishing is the Japanese publisher for it. And there I did write a special foreword to the Japanese talking about the similarity of benchmarking to Dantotsu, which is the state of being the best of the best, which is what you arrive at when they would call that world class.
Dantotsu. I almost confused that with Danamichi.
Yeah, you're showing your age.
Yeah, there you go. No, he was in that movie recently, where the aliens come from outer space and they jump in the bathtub and they get renewed. What was the name of that
I'm
film?
sorry, but I missed that one.
Okay, it was a good film. It was a good film. Richie Cunningham from Happy Days was the director.
Ron Howard.
Ron Howard, yeah, it was a Ron Howard
The
film.
other name.
What was it? Cocoon. That was the name of the film.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and Danamichi was in that. Coming back now, you've mentioned 2 types of benchmarking, strategic and operational. Are there any other kinds of benchmarking?
Well, Yes, there are, and I want to return to your observation about bench trending in discussing that, because here I'm showing a process model for benchmarking, and I've divided it into two phases. The first 7 steps are called conducting the study, and this is really where a lot of organizations will do what you call bench trending, what General Electric calls their best practice process. And this is a search to define what should change, the customer-driven issues. They select from that what they ought to benchmark and what they should study, what are going to be the measures. So they look at generic measures that are usable beyond their own company. What are the criteria for the partnership? This is where they build the analogy to other organizations. They'll conduct the secondary research to find out what they can learn in literature, primary research when it's called for, to go and visit the corporations or do questionnaires or telephone interviews. They'll calculate the gap and compare the processes. So this is really what I would call, if you will, your bench trending process, where you carry a set of measures or a set of processes that are critical to your business forward and say, these are the measurements, and when these have a significant gap between ourselves and companies we've been able to identify as best in class, then we know we have to make some improvements. The second half of this benchmarking process, implementing the results, is really about making the improvements. And essentially, if you take a look at this, it's really no different from classic project management that would learn in industrial engineering. So you're talking about projecting the future performance levels, identifying the actions to close the gap, setting the goals, and these may indeed be the stretch goals, obtaining the support and communicating around the organization, making the changes, monitoring the results, and then reevaluating your study requirements at the end. So this piece here may be a part of everybody's strategic planning process. And a lot of these steps are conducted on a regular basis in organizations where they feel a need for a lot of competitive information.
You know, that looks very familiar to me. It looks a lot like the process model or checklist that comes out of the benchmarking consortium, International Benchmarking Clearinghouse, from the APQC, the American Productivity and Quality Center. As I recall, you were part of that organization. Did you have something to do with the creation of their checklist?
Well, yes. When I was there after I left Compaq, I was the director of corporate quality at Compaq. Left there in 1991 and served as the vice president for benchmarking during the startup period of the International Benchmarking Clearinghouse. And one of the roles I had was to study all the different process models that companies had for benchmarking. Now, interestingly enough, this is not exactly the one that we do. I developed this one because it worked for a client organization, and I liked explaining this. As a matter of fact, this is the one that I shared with the National Performance Review and
That's right. You
Federal Quality
Institute. You did some work for the Vice President, Al Gore, didn't you?
Yes. One of the initiatives in reinventing the government, putting the customer first is a theme that Mr. Clinton and Mr. Gore have declared for. They decided that there were 3 things that they wanted to do, and benchmarking was one of those. And so I was invited by the Federal Quality Institute to design a course along with several other people who've written books, Kate Liebfried from Coopers & Lybrand, Jerry Baum from IBM, to name a couple, Laura Longmire from Texas Instruments, and to create a course that we could use then within the federal government to describe benchmarking and convince senior management of the need for using this practice within government.
You know, there's a thing called a code of conduct that the APQC and the International Benchmarking Clearinghouse uses. How does that relate to benchmarking? I'm not quite sure why a code of conduct is necessary.
Well, it's interesting. Most companies have an ethical practice, a set of norms or conventions that they believe their employees ought to follow in terms of what doing business in a good way is all about. Now, there is no real code, or had been no real code, for intercompany cooperation other than the laws on antitrust. And they don't provide you a high moral code in terms of how we ought to behave. Sam Bookhart, who had been at DuPont and was the benchmarking coordinator, was the initial author of this on behalf of the Strategic Planning Institute's Council on Benchmarking. Sam was also in the International Benchmarking Clearinghouse, and we worked together on refining this with all the member companies. Today, for instance, SPI, this is Strategic Planning Institute, has about 50 or so member companies in their council on benchmarking, which is focused on companies that are in an advanced state in their benchmarking processes.
Where are they located?
Well, SPI is actually located here in Boston.
Really?
And then the International Benchmarking Clearinghouse is down in Houston, Texas.
That reminds me, to the folks that are watching, later on in the telecast, we're going to put a thing up on your screen that identifies all these various organizations that Greg is talking about with their phone numbers and the directors of the organization, so that you don't have to call in and say, would you repeat that name, or would you give us a phone number? How do we reach them? We'll be showing you those as we proceed on. And speaking of phones, and forgive me, Greg, while I mentioned this, I should have mentioned it before. For those of you who are just watching this for the first time, this is an interactive show. That doesn't mean that Greg and I talk to each other. It means that you and I can talk to each other, and you can talk to Greg as well. The folks here at Northeastern University have established both a phone number, a telephone number, and a fax number, which is up on the screen right now. And what I would do is urge you to consider things that you think that either we have not clarified sufficiently, or things that you'd like to hear us discuss that we haven't discussed, and give us a call. We'll put you on the air if you'd like, or if you prefer not to be on the air, just send us a fax, and I'll be able to read the questions here, and Greg and I will discuss your questions or your comments. If, on the other hand, you'd like to be heard, as we've had people call in previously, we'll get you on the air. And if you've ever watched Larry King live, you know that you're going to be able to be heard here in the studio, so that Greg and I will hear you, as will all of the people who are watching, and there are quite a few, as I understand it. And then we'll be able to respond to your questions and discuss it with you real time, so that if we don't answer your question completely the first time through, you'll be able to ask follow-on questions. So please, call, fax, whatever. The whole show was designed to be interactive, and if you don't call in, gee, it seems like such a waste to have established all the communications capability. Greg is in all modesty, would not say this, but a very expensive and a very highly called upon consultant. And the likelihood of most companies being able to afford to bring him in, unless you're a very large organization, is probably fairly slim. Here's a chance to get him at virtually no cost to you. He's here, he's live, he's talking openly about all the things that he knows about benchmarking, both strategic and operational. And if you don't call in and you walk away from this telecast dissatisfied because we didn't cover the right topics for you, then don't look at us, folks. Look in the mirror if you're looking for somebody to blame, because we want to provide you with every single answer on the subject of benchmarking that we can. So it's up to you. We're not mind readers. I don't do a Kreskin thing. It's you've got to call us and tell us, or fax us and tell us what your questions are, your concerns are, and we'll do the best that we can to respond to those concerns. Forgive me, Greg. I just wanted to mention that. Coming back now, okay, so we see this process model. We know about the benchmarking consortium and their checklist. We know about the code of conducts. What can we expect are the outcomes of this benchmarking study? Once we've gone through these 12 steps, what are the expected outcomes? What are we going to see as an organization?
Really, there are two things. As we go through this first half of the study, we're going to find that we have a set of measures. This provides us the comparative data necessary to understand where we as an organization stand relative to the best organizations we've been able to discuss. Now, I don't like to say that we've really found world class, because sometimes you'll just spend too much money getting out in the tail of the distribution where world class really exists. If you can find an organization that's 35 or 50% better than you, you've done well, and you don't need to spend all the additional time. Now, we find the measure, and that gives us something to shoot at. It also provides us some psychological confidence. The old 1980 video, if Japan can, why can't we? Well, if they can, why can't we?
Right.
And let's take the lesson that they learn and the practices that they learn and bring them in here. So that's the second thing. And in benchmarking, people call these enablers. Enablers of success to achieve the same level of performance.
Could you describe what you mean by this enabler? I assume you mean some kind of process enabler, and maybe give us an example?
Certainly. Enablers are particular focused management processes or process actions. For instance, if I was benchmarking research and development, one of the things that I know you love dearly and spend a lot of your time working on, and I go out to find out what is happening. We find in the automobile industry some striking improvements have happened over the years. Since 1983, when concept to car was 6 years, we see it moving down towards 3. What happened to get that 50% reduction in time to market in an 11-year period? Well, the things we find are enablers. The use of quality function deployment as a tool to better define the customer requirements so we don't continuously churn the process of designing the product. The use of reliability growth engineering so that you understand the growth process in terms of this delivered product to the customer and how mature it's becoming over time. The use of multifunctional teams. Now, all of these you could sit back and say, wow, I know about them just from reading the literature. Well, a lot of people don't. And then they ask the question, yeah, I saw it in the literature, but how do you actually do it?
Well, that's the next question. How do you go about using the enabler?
Well, this is where I like the idea of creative imitation. When you take a look and you see that an organization has done something differently, there are 2 reasons to go visit them. One, to validate that all the literature and the rumors that you've heard are really true. So validation is one, and this is the same as a Baldrige site visit. But the second is really to ask the personal questions, those little human factors like, how did you really make this team come together? For instance, one of the legends, if you will, in manufacturing is from Motorola Corporation in the first winner of the Baldrige Prize or award, where they won based on a case study that was included in the application on the Bandit Pocket Pager. Now, what did they do differently in forming the cross-functional team to make that pocket pager get to market so much quicker and be so much better than the prior generation? Well, that's the interpersonal skills. And you don't learn that by just reading a book or reading the articles or seeing a cold measurement. You find out about the interpersonal piece by making the visit and talking to the people.
To use the term creative imitation, could you give us kind of a nice thumbnail a definition, so if people that are watching the show wanted to talk to people that in their organization about creative imitation, and they say, well, what are you talking about? They could give them some kind of reasonable definition?
Yeah. You know, one of the pieces of profound knowledge from Dr. Deming was he constantly said, adapt, don't adopt. And he's saying, you need to change things. No 2 organizations are exactly the same. No 2 cultures are the same or businesses are the same. So you just can't take what worked over there and plop it in here. And some people, I think, get the idea that benchmarking is going out, taking a list of 10 best practices. We're going to take this from Rubbermaid, this from Hewlett-Packard, this from Federal Express, shake them up in a bag, and all of a sudden, we've got a world-class company. We'll probably have a fractured organization trying to pull in a lot of different ways. So what they need to do is be orchestrated to work together as a system. And that's really why I developed the second book, the follow-on to Strategic Benchmarking.
The Business Systems Engineering book.
Exactly. Because in that book, what I try to say is there are 2 tools that are exceptionally helpful for a systems approach to business. One is benchmarking, where you learn and you find out where organizations can go and what their opportunities for success are. And then the second is re-engineering, where we're talking about how do we make these processes really work smoothly to reduce the time, reduce the cost, and improve the quality.
You know, if I can, you know, normally on these shows, we talk about the the particular guest, in this case yourself, and the topics that they're especially well known for. But if you folks will excuse me, I've got to tell you, I've got in addition to the new QFD book that came out just last month, that Jack Moran and I did, called the Executive Handbook on Quality Function Deployment, Defining Management's Roles and Responsibilities. I have another book coming out with 2 friends of mine in December. This is published by Von Nostra and Reinhold. It's called From Concept to Customer, an Introduction to Integrated Product and Process Development and Business Process Reengineering. And these 2 authors, these co-authors I have with me, Harry Jackson and Norm Fregon, co-authored a book that came out earlier this year called Management 2000, and it's already on the bestseller list in nonfiction with the Barnes & Noble book chain. And so I'm really enthused about the fact that we're going to be coming out with this process reengineering and integrated product and process development book, all of it together, talking about not only those two tools, but the support tools like QFD, quality function deployment, and design of experiments, and the various support structure. But you know, we were mentioning about your books. I wanted to let you know I'm trying to keep up with you.
I think it's the other way around, Jack. I'm trying to keep up with you.
So, you're mentioning reengineering. We know that benchmarking is helpful to support reengineering. What other management practices does it support?
Well, benchmarking can support strategic planning, for instance. When, for instance, let's just focus on strategic planning for a moment. In strategic planning, what we're trying to do is determine the long-range goals of the organization, the objectives, and a lot of organizations will set what they call stretch goals. You mentioned them earlier. And so one of the questions is, how do we pull together a sequence of changes to make the shift that we're looking for over the long term for the organization? Now, the operational benchmarking works at the work process level. Strategic benchmarking is looking again across the organization for the longer term. It's trying to identify major shifts that we want to make in the organization. And so strategic benchmarking is one of the tools to support the strategic planning process. It can work in the work process redesign at the operational level as well. There's a whole spectrum of things that you can use where you need to pull in learning from other organizations to challenge your group to improve better and then to give them some ideas on how they can improve. So that ties in the creative imitation as well.
You know, I remember the first time I was exposed to the concept of benchmarking. It was 2 years after you were. It was in 1986 when I did my initial reading about quality function deployment, where in the House of Quality, the A1 matrix, we talked about both technical benchmarking and competitive benchmarking as a part of the quality function deployment study. And that's when I first became aware of benchmarking and how it supported this TQM tool we call quality function deployment.
And I think that's really the primary application of benchmarking in terms of the product-related focus. Another one that happens, and many organizations will do this, is competitive product analysis, either for the marketing folks where they might do pricing studies or do feature comparisons. In many of the MBA programs, they call that SWOT analysis.
SWOT?
SWOT. That's like when the team comes in with the black jackets and the AK-47. It's the strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats analysis.
So it's SWOT.
OT, yes, right. And it's basically the same part of that A1 matrix where you're doing your competitive analysis.
Okay, give us those words again for SWOT.
SWOT is strength, weakness, opportunity, and threat.
That's really neat. I like that, SWOT.
It's focused on your market opportunity, your strengths, your weaknesses relative to your competitors. Where do you have opportunities to improve, and where are your competitors threatening? You
know, that sounds like you could make a nice L-shaped matrix out of that.
It does work that way, Jeff.
Yeah, I bet it does. Well, you know, folks, we're getting kind of close to break time now. We've only got about a minute left. We're still looking for some calls from you or faxes, either one. If you'd like, you know, we're going to take a 10-minute break here in just another half a minute or so. Greg and I go out and have a little drink of water and see how things are going. And then we'll come back on the hour and go for an additional hour talking about benchmarking as both a quality and a management practice. So we're looking for you to contribute to the discussion here. If you don't call in, if you don't fax in, I will personally be disappointed and will probably come out and get you. But I don't have the budget for all of you, but I will get some of you. So please participate in this. Learn from it by calling or faxing in your questions. And Greg and I will be back here in just a few minutes to talk about some more about benchmarking, both strategic and operational, and the various aspects of the various tools that it helps to support. And at this point, I think we're just about ready to go to break. And so what I'm going to do is suggest that if you have not already formulated your questions, that you take this opportunity to think about it, and we'll be back to talk to you in just a couple of minutes. Hi, welcome back. This is the second half of CITV, Continuous Improvement Television, with myself, Jack ReVelle, and my guest today, Greg Watson. We're talking about benchmarking, both as a quality practice and as a management practice. We're into our second hour now, for those of you that might just be joining us. Greg, let's talk for just a minute. You made kind of a peripheral reference earlier to the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. I know that you and I are both aware that item 2.2 of the Malcolm Baldrige criteria makes reference to benchmarking, if not the word benchmarking, certainly the concept of benchmarking and what's expected. Could you discuss that a little bit with us for those viewers who are part of organizations that either are already participating in a Baldrige assessment or application or are considering it?
Certainly. Category 2 in the Baldrige Award is on information and analysis, and the subsection on benchmarking is 2.2. That category is really to describe how we use information in an organization, what sort of analysis we perform, and benchmarking is cited as a tool that can lead to competitive analysis or to competitive breakthrough, really, for the organization. And there are really two criteria that are looked at in the organization relative to benchmarking. The first is that organizations, when they identify their goals and their strategic objectives, must find a way to measure them and benchmark them so that they have an external standard of comparison. You know, most operational reviews that are done by senior management teams on a quarterly basis are of your internal numbers, comparing your organization versus past or historical performance. Right. Benchmarking, though, gets you outside, and this is where your bench trending helps. It allows you to have an external standard of comparison for what excellence is and how we should be operating. So that's the first piece. The second thing, though, that is in that item that's, I think, very important, and a lot of people miss it, is that it asks you for the criteria by which you evaluate other organizations against whom you're going to benchmark or use as a partner for benchmarking. And this is really saying we expect you to have an analogy built that's a formal set of criteria. That says, for instance, the business part of the analogy says we're looking for companies that are transaction processing, if we're a bank, for instance, that may have multiple sites. It might have to do with geographic distribution. It might have to deal with the type of manufactured product in terms of the technology employed. So all that is in the business part of the model. And then the cultural part might have to deal with the organizational structure, centralized, decentralized. It might have to deal with the decision-making aspects of management and the empowerment of teams, the use of teams, where they're used. So all of these then form the cultural side. And together that would be the set of criteria. And interestingly enough, world-leading companies have sat down, and the winners of the Baldrige are the ones that have said, these are the criteria we're looking for. And what it does is it gives them a good objective standard for understanding how to make competitive analysis as well, because these are the things that are important to us. You know, recently articles in Harvard Business Review over the last 4 years or so have talked about things like process capability, core competence, strategic intent, and those are the sorts of things that you'd wrap up into this same set of things. So what are we using for comparisons? What's important to us versus others? So it's really the set of standards for comparison that we're using.
Are there any standards that you would suggest might be common to most organizations?
I think there are a couple. The first is in terms of what I consider core business processes. And really there are sort of four that are in most companies what I'd call their value chain. The first is in terms of the product planning process. How do they plan for the future? How do they create, if you will, technology transfers, make the decision about what should be a product or design a service? The next piece is product generation. How do they bring, and you mentioned your book on the integrated product
and process.
It's really the same product generation idea. How do we get the product to market from the concept to the car, if you will? The next piece is the delivery of that to the customers. And how do we then transfer the product we have internally to the customers? And this takes a look at the distribution systems, the service, installation, training, support, and all those sorts of functions. And the final is the long-term servicing of that process. Now, what I have done in the new book, the Business Systems Engineering book, is developed a process that shows how you evaluate a company to make strategic change happen using that value chain. Now, if it would be helpful, we could show the audience a little bit about how that process works and how they might be able to use it.
I think that's a great idea.
Let me show you first of all, the high-level process model. It starts off with an enterprise model, and I'll show you an example of an enterprise model in just a little bit.
Does that look like the USS Enterprise in Star Trek?
Something like Star Trek,
Yes.
exactly. And what it really is a set of related business processes that show how you develop value in conjunction with your suppliers and deliver it to your customers. And what the result of this model is the identification of your critical business processes. Another piece I call the measurement map, and some of you who are familiar with words used in quality might consider this a daily management system. It's how you measure the work process level at the bottom of the organization.
Performance measures, process metrics, they refer to them sometimes.
Exactly. And the combination of these points out those processes, work processes, that are having problems and quite frankly need some management intervention. They might need additional funding to make an improvement happen, or they might need to be integrated better and increase the communications across functional barriers that exist in an organization. Well, these two models and methodologies are used to identify what we need to focus on. Then the next piece in the analysis is process analysis. Now, process analysis is not new. We've been doing this for many years. We might call it process mapping. We might call it total quality management in terms of quality improvement process. And what it really is the identification, documentation, and measurement of how a work process is functioning. We then identify this for all of the critical processes and problem processes that we've noted for the organization. So we now have a matrix of ideas here that we've generated in measurements that tell us how our processes are working. We then have an internal standard of measurement. We then compare those externally to find out what's going on in the organization. So now we have the gap created. We see, hey, not only are we having a problem internally, but we're way behind the performance of other people, and here are the things that they're doing to improve. Now we're carrying and added to our matrix, if you will, another set of factors, and these are improvement potentials. So these are the opportunities we have. Now we go into classical problem solving. Problem solving is identifying the issue. What do we need to change? What are our alternatives? Well, one of the alternatives is technology that comes from the outside. Now, many times in looking at what some people have talked about in re-engineering, they almost look at this part of the piece of the puzzle only. And what we're talking about, and if you want to zoom in on this, is they're driving technology into the problem-solving process to select what they should focus on, generate a solution, and then managing the project. The thing that's different that we're saying is there's a whole chain that deals with process analysis that comes forward that we should bring in here to introduce the external comparison. And this goes all the way back to understanding what's wrong with our process based on the internal process analysis. So we're taking a more holistic view, if you will, in terms of what drives the selection process for major re-engineering projects.
You know, I wish I'd given that answer about a month ago. I was at Gold QPC teaching a course on process re-engineering, and I had this gentleman from an Air Force base in Massachusetts who was under orders to cut the size of the workforce by 50%. And the direction he'd received was to use process re-engineering to do it. And he was absolutely adamant that there was absolutely no need to process map or flow chart the process that these people were working under. He said, you know, it doesn't matter what they're doing now. We're going to do it differently, and we're going to cut the number of people in half. I wish that I had given him the answer that you just gave me, because this clearly illustrates the importance of understanding the as-is before you get into the should-be of a process.
That's exactly right, Jack, because one of the things that happens, well, you might remember from Campy's book and Hammer's book on re-engineering the corporation, that they cited somewhere on the order of 75% of re-engineering projects fail. And the reason they fail is that they have not established this clear linkage. This focuses you on selecting things that matter to the business, so it's clearly business focused. This gives you your internal analysis so you don't repeat your own mistakes. This gives you an external standard of excellence. You've almost set your lower limit and your upper limit, if you will.
Oh, I can understand terms like that immediately.
And so you said, we want to shoot somewhere in between there.
Yeah.
And here you get to set the criteria. Where are we going to shoot? What's important to us for this business activity?
That's our nominal specification.
Exactly. So we may not need to be world-class on this business process. Maybe I'm preaching a little heresy here
I don't think so.
by saying each business process needs a certain level of performance. It
Expectancy.
Exactly. And the expected value of that performance may not need to be world-class. It may need to be the best in your industry. And that may not be even close to world-class if you're in an industry that doesn't require a significant focus on that process.
Fascinating.
So this is how we put it together. Now, key to this is really the idea of the enterprise model. And because many people haven't seen one, I thought it might be helpful just to illustrate what an enterprise model looks like. This is a generic enterprise model, which I developed for the book. And it basically shows a couple of different domains. This domain here, where we see the supplier going to a group of connected arrows and the customers, are the cross-functional processes of the business. You might call these the value delivery system. This is how we define the value that we're going to deliver to the customers. And the employees add value as the process idea generates and matures across this spectrum. Now notice that each one of these areas is blown up and identified in terms of key business processes. What this is saying is that each of these key business processes has a contribution to this cross-functional process. Now, interestingly enough, as you start looking at some of these, you'll see that technology acquisition, for instance, plays into the product generation system because that's your feed. Supplier management is going to be important even in the service and field support because many of these processes now are going to relate across the whole organization.
So a lot of interdependencies there.
Many interdependencies. Interestingly enough, in Baldrige terms, down here, the bottom, we show 4 cross-functional processes: human resources, finance, quality, and information systems. These are called the business support processes, or here called, in Baldrige terms, here I call them the staff support processes. These are the infrastructure, if you will, that support the value delivery system. The other 2 pieces that support it and get a lot of visibility are the strategic and operational planning part, and then the market segmentation research and the marketing of the product. As the product comes through here, it matures, and the planning cycle goes from long range to daily management to production. So it becomes much faster, much more focused on delivering today what you need today. And the whole point of this is driving value to the customers. So what we have in a snapshot here now is the way a lot of business processes work together at a very high level. And what I would suggest is that in building an enterprise model, an organization would start with a structure like this and say, what's important to us? What is it in our business and what are our business factors that really work, that make us the success we are today or the success we want to be?
You know, it seems to me this is intuitively obvious, as you say, common sense. But I do a bit of consulting too, and rare is the company that I've run into that takes this what I would consider to be a most intelligent approach to it. What's your experience been?
There are a few organizations that have done this, and interestingly enough,
You want to give them credit for it on the air?
certainly. One is I first learned about this at Hewlett-Packard, and Hewlett-Packard developed a methodology I was involved in back in the late 80s. Called hierarchical process modeling, which this is the high level of that model, and it blows down. And I'll show you an example of how it goes down into the organization. Another one that I benchmarked back then was Plessey in the UK.
How do you spell that?
Plessey.
Okay.
They're an electronics, actually they're a conglomerate firm. And a third organization that has done this is Xerox. Now, there are many others. A lot of organizations have used a tool that's been used in manufacturing and industrial engineering called IDEF, the Integrated Computer-Aided Manufacturing. That's the I. Can you tell this is an Air Force program? Sorry, Air Force guys, if you're listening. DEF is definition language. And what it is a modeling process that allows you to represent a static model of the organization. That's IDEF 0. IDEF 1 is the data model that would support this for the measurement system. And then IDEF 2 is the, if you will, the timing sequence for how the data flows and what the interactions are over time.
These organizations that you're aware of that have been successfully implemented this, did it require a lot of effort on their part to initially to cause this to become a part of their culture, a part of the way they do business?
Yeah, this is not an easy task. Fortunately, though, it is something that once you've gone through it, you find the value of it and you decide this is something we're going to use for managing our organization long term. Xerox Corporation, perhaps more than any other corporation, has had a lot of experience in terms of re-engineering. They've had both successful and unsuccessful projects. And interestingly enough, I think the successful ones are the ones that have gone back and said, how do we relate to our business model? And they have a Xerox business model, which describes it, different notation, but basically the same concept.
Fascinating.
Now, when we've identified a business process that's critical to our business, we then do an analysis of it, or what some people in process terms would call a decomposition. And the decomposition really says this business process is composed of 3 or more work processes, each of which is almost like an integrated circuit, if you will, in terms of a printed circuit board. So if we focus in on this one integrated circuit, you'll see, and there we are, you'll see that it takes a look at this process in terms of the activities going on in work process B, and we see it as quality performing, so we have quality related measures, value adding, so we have value added measures, capability adding, so it's adding some capability to the flow that we're looking across it. It consumes cost, it consumes time, it has competency requirements to accomplish and resource requirements that make it flow. So we have a set of measurement characteristics that are common to almost every work process. And these are the ideas of the generic measures that we would use to start characterizing the work process. So process characterization is essentially a beginning point. Now, we're going back to Frederick Taylor, I think, when we start talking about process characterization, because this says, then all things become new again.
Do you realize that Frederick Taylor was like 100 years ago now?
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Scientific management, I think, was 1896.
Yeah. I'm noticing in looking at all 3 of the processes, A, B, and C, that the words underneath each of the blocks are the same. And I also notice that they can be categorized into inputs and outputs. So you've got literally a cause and effect relationship here, because you've got some of those bullets are things that are going into the process, others are things that are coming out.
Interestingly enough, there are a couple of tools that this supports very well. One is activity-based costing, where you're looking at the value added, the value before, value after for the cost consumed, so you have a value to cost ratio. Another is cycle time reduction, where you're looking at the time to complete and the reduction of that based on the number of steps, and you even are looking at skills mapping in terms of competency requirements. So this type of model supports a variety of things. Now, interestingly enough, I also believe that this is a fundamental way or set of measures that you would use in doing ISO 9000 documentation, for instance. So when you're developing a set of documentation for the purpose of generating a work process description sufficient for your ISO 9000 quality system, you may also be doing the very beginnings of the same characterization you knew for doing process benchmarking.
You know, that brings up an interesting point, mentioning both ISO and activity-based costing. Those are 2 topics that I would like to see addressed on this series. Now, we've already got the first half of 1995 scheduled. I've got Steve Ungvari, the president of the American Supplier Institute International, coming in February to talk about TRIZ, this newly discovered problem-solving technique that's been brought in from Russia. And then I've got Peter Schultes, the author of the Team Handbook, that's going to be talking about the importance of teaming. I've got Bill Conway, former CEO and chairman of Nashua Corporation, who was featured on that NBC white paper you mentioned earlier, if Japan can't, why can't we? First American CEO to recognize the importance of what Dr. Deming had to say and to bring Dr. Deming into his organization to help to do a better job of competing. And then I've got, in April, I've got Shin Taguchi talking about the robust design and the Taguchi loss function. And then in May, I've got George Box, one of the premier world-class statisticians talking about some design of experiments related topics, including his book, Statistics for Experimenters by Box, Hunter, and Hunter, a classic in the field. But for the second half of 95, you're mentioning of activity-based costing and ISO 9000. If there's any of you viewers that are out there that have an idea on who you would like to see and hear on this series, Continuous Improvement TV, talking about either ABC, activity-based costing, or ISO 9000, give us a call, send a fax, let us know, because I really want to get some of the leaders in the field on ABC and ISO in here to talk to you all and give you their perspectives on their respective areas of specialization. Forgive me for deviating for a second, but you're mentioning those two topics reminded me of their importance. Mm-hmm. Can we move on?
Sure.
Let's talk a little bit more about how benchmarking can support the strategic planning process. We've talked a bit about it before. What else can benchmarking do for us in strategic planning?
Well, I think a critical element of it is that once we have identified where the organization wants to go, now that doesn't require benchmarking. That's basically the, if you will, due diligence judgment of management based on a lot of things. Mm-hmm. And so once they've decided where they want the organization to go, strategic benchmarking can help focus the effort to get there. And so what we're doing then is saying, I see we've got the wrong title there.
Oh yeah, that folks, that's Greg's old title. Greg was a VP at Xerox. He is now the managing partner for Business Systems Solutions in Victor, New York. But that was once a correct title. It is not currently its title.
Right. And so in the use of benchmarking and strategic planning, it's really how do we crisply define the initiative we want to make in terms of the change, and then to get the team going to actually make that change implementation. Perhaps an example of strategic study might be helpful. When I think of benchmarking studies, there are really three different things that will trigger whether or not we should benchmark. The first thing is, and I'll start at the bottom and work up to the strategic piece. The first thing is at the bottom is we have something broken and needs to be fixed. And we might see we have too many defects. We might see it takes too long to do something. We might see it costs too much to do something. We say there's obviously a need for us to make an improvement. Now, in making this improvement, what we are doing is benchmarking to understand how other organizations have improved, what should be an appropriate goal. So we're doing this basically at the process level. This is usually used for operational benchmarking. If organizations are so broke that they've got this kind of power, they're in a crisis. Now, the second kind of trigger is really an unusual one. You need to innovate. Now, this breaks the whole paradigm of what we've talked about in terms of benchmarking. And the paradigm is broken in terms of saying what we need to do is to create something that we've never done before. And an example of this goes back to my days at Compaq Computer. In the 1980s, Compaq had grown successful by having a dealer-focused distribution system. They didn't deal directly with its customers. During 1991, it became obvious that they needed to have this happen. And Compaq has had a history of doing things rapidly. And so rather than doing a full-blown benchmarking study and taking the time, they said, we have to innovate and create something new. We don't need to find the best. We've never done this before. Let's find really excellent practices that have a solid reputation for excellence. And so they went and looked at places like American Express, Federal Express, and Xerox that had direct dial 1-800 numbers that serviced their customers. And they said, what are they doing? What are their processes? And they used that then as a benchmark for designing their own. So this is the second trigger, a need to innovate. The third trigger is even more difficult, and that's when there's a need to change the policy for how an organization operates. Now, I can't say the name of this company, but there's one organization that decided they need a totally different policy towards quality. And rather than trying to determine internally by just brainstorming, for instance, and innovating themselves what they ought to do. They said, what are the quality policies of other organizations, and how could we adapt them for our own quality policy? So they went to take a look at how do other organizations design their quality systems, implement them, and what sort of factors are important in their development of a quality infrastructure to move them ahead for the future. So all of the policies and decisions around the development of the quality system. So those are the three types. And so the triggers can be a crisis at the business level. Well, in reality, Xerox is a good example of this at a strategic level. Something happened fundamentally that changed their business. Same thing happened to Compaq when the distribution channels changed. And they saw a loss in profitability of about $800 million in 1 year. That's a big loss for any company.
That covers your whole salary.
Definitely for several years to come. And so what happened with Compaq was they focused the organization on the very vital few things that needed to change. This is what Dr. Duran says in the Pareto principle, focus on the vital few. And through 4 major initiatives, Compaq restructured the organization to deal in a fast time to market initiative with low-cost products that were delivered through a more direct access to the company. The result of that, in 1991, they had done $3.2 billion, and then last year, Compaq did $7.2 billion, doubling their sales revenue in about 2 years. And that's because they'd totally restructured, and that's after 1991's experience where they had their first ever loss.
And that's now being reflected in their stock, isn't it?
Well, the stock significantly has moved up in that period of time. This is an interesting observation where people say they don't see where they get the gain from quality or where they get the gain from quality improvement tools. Well, certainly benchmarking is a quality improvement tool. The stock value from Compaq went from the low of in the 20s up now to around $100 a share in that same period of time, 2 years.
Not an insignificant amount.
Not an insignificant amount. That could make your retirement plan.
It could, several times over. You know, hearing you talk for the last hour and a half about benchmarking, there's just no, if there was ever a question of mine, and there really wasn't, about the value of benchmarking, it would seem to me that everybody would be doing it. But if everybody would be doing it, if it was easy, it must be that it's difficult to do. What's difficult about doing benchmarking, or more specifically a benchmarking study?
Really, there are a couple of points that become stumbling blocks for organizations. The first is deciding what should we benchmark and making that selection process, which is why I focused on the systems model towards the improvement of the business and making those selections. The second piece, though, is in identifying where to get the information. A lot of people stumble over this. And as you remember, Jack, in the QFD initial days, people were really asking the question, but where do we get this kind of information? And so you need to understand all of the sources of information available to you. I've worked with several companies, and just going through the discovery process, they find that they had much more information internally than they ever thought they possibly had. Mm-hmm. They had clipping services that brought news items that only went to marketing. They had customer service data that only went to the support organization. They had marketing pricing studies and attitude studies that just went to market research. They had other studies that only went to the product development team. By bringing all of those together, you can have a much more comprehensive perspective on the external data for what's available. So that's the second major problem.
That really is, I think, if I can interrupt for a second, an excellent use of the new information technology that we talk about in process reengineering. Mm-hmm. This information that's already available, put it on an email, for example, mm-hmm. and share it around the company so that everybody's aware of it, so that the technology transfer can take place, with great ease.
That's exactly right. As a matter of fact, in Chapter 8 of my new book, I focus on information technology, particularly group technology. Things like Lotus Notes, where you can have people working together on the same product at the same time in different places.
Yes.
And that sort of synergy, if you will, can be gained because you're now bringing information across organizations mm-hmm. and sharing it.
Yeah, they used to say knowledge is power. Now they say sharing of knowledge is power.
That's exactly.
That to keep knowledge to yourself may be a very limiting factor for an organization. And so the organizations that are truly, in my mind, the most successful ones are the ones that share information across all boundaries so that anybody that may have a need for it can have immediate access to it, rather than trying to find out where in the organization does it exist, if in fact it exists at all.
That's true. Continuing on with problems that you can run into, or pitfalls, if you will, I think that the next pitfall is that people don't communicate well. Many times organizations will find that they've learned something, and they might have, let's just say, done a work process benchmarking study of a wave solder machine. And so their work team has learned something and they've improved their work process. But how many wave solder machines do you have in your whole corporation? And how do you get that improvement from that one distributed across all of those same or similar work processes? And this is where the communication concept, or the internal communication, becomes a real need. Because it's not just improving the one, but it's then leveraging that improvement across the whole organization. If you only saved $1,000 on that one wave solder machine, that might not be too significant, maybe for the individual workstation budget, but in the grand scheme of things, not really. But if you had 200, 300 machines times $1,000, you're starting to talk some real money that you can make a difference with.
Now, one of the barriers to communication, especially in the transfer of knowledge across an organization internally, is the NIH, the not invented here syndrome. In your travels and your experience with your clients and your employers, have you found any way to overcome what appears to be a natural barrier to accepting information, communication that is provided because it was not invented there within the organization?
Interestingly enough, there's a syndrome that I'm not the first to note it. I remember Halberstram in a speech at Gold QPC years ago quoted George Romney, and he said that success breeds arrogance. And most organizations that are successful feel like we're successful because we have done these things, and therefore we'll continue to do these things. And we don't need to learn from other organizations who haven't achieved the same as we have. Now, interestingly enough, several years ago, a man named Danny Miller wrote a book called The Icarus Paradox. And in it, he described what happens to organizations that have achieved success, that have their fixed formula, and then they keep locking in on that formula and making it more and more pure. And the observation, looking in the computer industry indeed, was that those organizations that have locked in on their fixed success formula have ended up seeing all signal and no noise and having no standard of comparison. And so I think it's important that we identify that standard of comparison. Keep the gap in front of us so we know where we are relative to others and keep learning. Relative to NIH, though, it's really the same concept on a different side. NIH comes about because we're proud of the things we do. And
and distrustful of others.
And very distrustful of others. I think some of the manifestations of it are, if you take a look at an organization that has multiple business units, you might find 5 or 6 problem-solving models that exist across those business units. Now, as a general manager, you need to ask yourself, are we selling problem-solving models to our customers? Or are we selling our product or service to the customers? Maybe we should have one model, have one team from the quality organization or a cross-functional team or wherever, create the one, and then let us all use that one model, and not keep spending our innovative energy, which is limited, to do things that are not going to be directly focused on the customer. A strange thing happens when this occurs. And I only really know of a few companies where they've implemented it well. Xerox happens to be one of them. They have 100,000 people worldwide using the same problem-solving process. So when teams come together from different cross-functional areas, they don't have to spend a half a day baselining themselves, understanding their language. They already have a common language.
Now, I'm sure it wasn't always that way, Greg. How
No.
did Xerox go about institutionalizing, making a part of the culture, a standard process across all the various international operations, that it has?
Well, Jack, that is a secret of their whole Baldrige journey, if you will. They identified it, and top management did identify it. Dave Kearns in 1983, he had been the Xerox executive who was focused on Fuji Xerox, observed in their Deming Prize application process certain traits that made them really good. And one of the things he observed was the common use of problem-solving processes and quality improvement processes. And so that became a piece, if you will, of the Green Book, their quality strategy, which they developed in 1983 and have implemented now for over 10 years.
You know, I'd like to go on because we've only got about 25 minutes left, and that reminds me, I haven't heard that phone ring. You know, this is not a telethon where you got to pledge money. You pay for the call perhaps, but the information is at no cost to you. Of course, on the other hand, you get what you pay for. What I would urge you to do is give us a call. I hate to see you walk away from this telecast and say, gee, I wish I'd asked. You've only got about another 25 minutes or so before we call it a day. So please give us a call, send a fax, and let us know what your comments and questions are. If we don't hear from you, we'll have to assume that we're covering the right things, whether we are or we aren't. Well, coming back, before I ask you my next question, Greg, I wanted to mention something to our audience. Since I've been here in Boston for the last couple of days, I had a chance to catch up on some of my reading on the airplane, and I got my latest copy here of Quality Digest magazine that arrived just a week or so ago, and I happen to think very highly of Quality Digest magazine to begin with. I think it's, in addition to Quality Progress and Quality magazines, three of the top magazines that are available for people who are in the business of continuous improvement. But they have a particular article in here, in Quality Digest, that I'd like to show you here called Benchmarking for Best Practices, Winning Through Innovative Adaptation. I went through and I read this, and you'll recall I shared this with you not too long ago, and I happen to think it's an excellent article. It does not, in 5 or 6 pages, describe as thoroughly as you have here today all the background about benchmarking, but on the other hand, for people who are just now getting into the hearing about benchmarking and learning about benchmarking and looking for a quick primer to get started, at least learn the vocabulary and the basic concepts before they get into, to your book or Bob Camp's book or some of the other books that are available. I would certainly urge them to get this Quality Digest magazine. This is the August 1994 issue, and read that article about benchmarking. If you've already got a copy of the magazine itself, and I've managed to lose my place already, here it is. It's on page 52. So I just wanted to mention that so that our audience could gain from that.
It's an interesting article, too, in that it's written by a combination, 2 authors, one who is a consultant and does benchmarking assistance to companies, and the benchmarking manager, Mike English, for GTE.
Yeah, now you know him, don't you?
Yes, he's the representative from GTE to the International Benchmarking Clearinghouse.
Okay.
Now, it's interesting, that clearinghouse now is more than 300 companies that are at various stages of their benchmarking journey, if you will.
Is it companies or organizations?
Most of them are companies. There are some partnering organizations who share, like the Best Practices organization from the Navy that observes manufacturing practices in DoD contractors, and they have shared their processes. There have some international participation both in the United Kingdom and Mexico and Australia, as just to name a few, of organizations. They also have some cross-industry groups like the Healthcare Forum that's focused on quality improvement that are also in the sharing with the clearinghouse. And I think one of the key things has been that there are now these forums that have developed that provide an opportunity to make the contacts between the companies for the purpose of sharing, with the code of conduct as the means for describing how we will operate and how we'll behave relative to each other. I think it's key that organizations realize this is not just about doing a research study. It's about doing something, a sharing, if you will, collaboration among businesses, based on the principle of exchange, which is one of the principles in the Code of Conduct.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because in reading through that article I just made mention of, one of the things that they point out is one of the most foolish things that you can do is try to go outside your own organization and start benchmarking until you've done the as-is study internally to know where you are, so you can learn what the right questions are, so that when you talk to your partners in benchmarking, that you understand what it is that you should be asking them, so you don't waste their time or yours.
Well, actually, that was the fourth of the four pieces that I hadn't quite finished on in terms of the major pitfalls, and that is not mapping your own study. So that you understand the process and how it operates, how you measure it, what you've learned from the past. And you know, a funny thing happens. I remember one company that was taking a look at this, and they started benchmarking. They say, we need to improve this particular production manufacturing process. And when they took a look at it, they mapped out 200 and something steps, and they realized they only added value in less than 10% of them. And they said, we don't need to go benchmark. We just need to fix the process. And you know, it was a self-discovery step. Interestingly enough, in strategic benchmarking, I do draw an analogy in the learning part of the organization between the learning theory of John Dewey and the plan, do, check, act cycle of Dr. Deming. And the beginning of both of them is a discovery step. And that's what benchmarking really gets you into, is thinking about discovery and what you could do differently.
Yeah, my wife's an attorney, and she tells me the discovery step is a very important one in working for your clients.
This is one of the few times in TV we're not supposed to mention O.J. Simpson, right? So we won't talk about discovery, I think.
O.J. who?
Yeah.
You're on the jury.
Yeah,
yeah, right.
the nation has learned now the importance of discovery in that,
yes.
in that climate.
Coming back to benchmarking, we were talking about benchmarking partners. How do organizations that want to benchmark identify who would be their best potential benchmarking partners?
Well, there are several different approaches. Sometimes it's involved in the networking of senior management. Many people in senior management have, as myself, moved from one company to another and had a variety of experiences. And you develop a natural network of people that you know in different organizations. You remember historical performance of these organizations. You say, they really did something very well in this process, and I wish we could do it here. So it's through, if you will, executive knowledge is one domain. Another is in the secondary research phase. When you're taking a look at a particular work process and you go out and there's something like 5,000 electronic databases available today. If you start chaining together keywords that identify your work process, for instance, you might be talking in the computer industry, so computers might be one. If you're looking at product distribution, you might have the picking process as another. You might take a look at 3 or 4 terms that identify crisply what it is you're looking for. And then take a look and ask the systems to call out what company names. And then build a little Pareto in terms of how often are companies mentioned, and the most often mentioned companies. So that's another way to identify potential partners. A third way is to take a look at organizations that have won recognition. A Baldrige Award, for instance, is one type of recognition. Purchasing medal, a functional medal, or performance from distribution, Modern Materials Magazine.
The NASA medal.
The NASA award. All of these, the awards basically fit into one of 2 categories: an overall category for excellence or a functional category for excellence. So as you take a look at these, you might have something like the Shingo Prize, which is functional excellence in manufacturing. Those winners, if you want to look at manufacturing, might provide you with a good basis for taking a look at the focus. If you're interested in something that's more of an HR thing, you might take a look at winners of the RIT USA Today Quality Cup, for instance, where you're taking a look at how teams perform. And now you're looking at if you will, cross-functional piece out of the HR that gives you an idea of where excellence exists. So these are all different ways you can generate concepts of excellence.
Gotcha. Okay, that's good. And mentioning that USA Today RIT Quality Cup competition, good segue into comment. Today's issue, today being, what is today? September 9th, 1994. Is that right?
12.
12. Looked at the wrong, can't read my own watch.
You like Fridays.
Yeah. today's issue, Monday, September 12th of USA Today, on the front page has a little cut in there about sending in your applications for the Quality Cup competition for 1994. I don't have the phone number here, but if you get a copy of USA Today, there's an 800 number you can call in Alexandria, Virginia, and they will send you a copy of the application for the USA Today RIT Quality Cup competition. If you've got a team or an individual who's done an especially outstanding job of innovation, creativity, benchmarking, process improvement, quality deployment, whatever the case may be, I would urge you to give that team an opportunity for national recognition. The USA Today RIT Quality Competition will be accepting these applications until December, and we, the judges, will be meeting the first week in January to evaluate the applications, and I would hope that some of you who are watching today will call and get a copy of the application and submit the application on behalf of an individual or team or teams within your organization that are deserving of recognition for achievement. So thank you for mentioning the Quality Cup competition.
Well, that actually gives a segue to something else. One of the things that the International Benchmarking Clearinghouse has done has created a series of awards for benchmarking.
Yes, I've heard about that.
And so they have an award that deals with the best practice for a study, for instance. They have an award that deals with a research contribution, either from academia or from a corporation. And then the third is for overall excellence in developing and deploying a benchmarking program. So 3 different categories, and if you want to start out by benchmarking, if you will, those application submission documents are available through the clearinghouse.
Didn't they just within the last few weeks announce their awards for this year?
They announced the application process to begin.
Okay.
It's on a time cycle that's completes with selection, I believe, the end of April, and then we present the awards the first week in June.
Okay, you're a judge for that.
Right, I'm a judge on that process.
And
also.
I'm a judge for the Quality Cup competition. So, folks, between Greg and myself, get your applications in, and we'll make sure that you get proper attention, okay? And now, coming back to the subject of benchmarking itself. Earlier, I think you used the term analogous organizations. I got to be honest, the term has only vague meaning for me. Could you give me a fuller explanation of an analogous organization?
I think it's important to think of an analogy.
You got to be able to say it before you can define it.
If you can say it, you can define it. An analogy in terms of how do you make an adaptation from one organization to another. Now, the analogy builds upon both the business model and the cultural model. But just to give some examples, how do you do this? For instance, Frito-Lay has put in place a very interesting product distribution system where they can directly read the stocking levels at different stores. Now that idea, if you trace it back, came from the Canadian Railroad's railroad car distribution and tracking system. And the analogy there was we both have something we need to keep track of. It's perishable. The information itself can only be recorded at the source. We can only know where the car is. Somebody might have shunted it off on a side track, for instance. If it's carrying produce or something that is time critical, we need to keep making it move along. So both of them had those similarities. Another example of analogy is the LL Bean story.
I was just going to ask you if that was an analogous organization.
Right. So Xerox and LL Bean, you wouldn't ordinarily think of a company that ships copiers and someone who ships hunting boots as being similar. But they both have some very critical processes that are the same in how they distribute the product, in terms of how you pick it out of inventory and get it to the point of shipment, for instance.
Okay, so the term analogous organization might be a little bit misleading. It doesn't necessarily have to be an organization that is analogous. It's the function that's analogous,
right,
per se.
And it depends, again, now on the level that we're doing the benchmarking study. If we're doing an operational study, for instance, the LL Bean example I just gave you of picking would be an operational study. The example for Frito-Lay and the Canadian Railroad, you might argue is strategic, because you're changing the whole way the organization's using information and planning, and the cross-functional process of production even is going to be affected by how they use that data. So you can make the example for either type of benchmarking, either strategic or operational. The analogy is essential. For instance, in taking a look at Compaq, I mentioned earlier the 1-800 number study they use in terms of how organizations use telephone conferencing. And what they did was they said, here are some organizations that are like us. Federal Express. Well, how's Federal Express like a computer manufacturer? Xerox. They make copiers. It's a different type of product. And so you can go on and take a look at some of these particular ideas. And the key is saying, how are they like us? And so that's the key piece of learning, if you will, in terms of designing the study that needs to be done up front. And that analogy is helpful in two particular places. The first place it's helpful is in terms of identifying partner companies who we want to benchmark. And the second place it's helpful is in understanding how to adapt the lessons learned from other organizations to our own. Because by understanding that analogy, the comparison between the two, we know what we should keep the same and what we should change. What are the elements that are going to give us and our organization the highest payoff?
Gotcha.
That way we don't create a cultural or a business discontinuity between the organizations when we're making the change happen.
Makes sense. We're getting kind of close to the end here. I see just under 10 minutes before we close. I'd like to put this on the screen before I forget. Let me get it up here so that you can see all of them. Could you back off? There you go. Here we have, this is a list that Greg has prepared for us. The American Productivity and Quality Center, the APQC, in Houston, and hopefully you can read the number there, area code 713-685-4666, if you're interested in either affiliating with the APQC or more specifically with the International Benchmarking Clearinghouse. And of course, our organization, the American Society for Quality Control in Milwaukee, the Quality Management Division, has a benchmarking committee of which Brian Lowenthal is currently the chair. And phone number you can reach ASQC, this is the central number for all of ASQC, is 800-248-1946. And then we have the Benchmarking Exchange. Tom Dolan is the director. You can reach them at area code 408-662-9800. And then finally, if we could drop the camera down just a fraction here, let's see, there we go. The Strategic Planning Institute, Council on Benchmarking here in the Boston area, and you can reach them at area code 617-491-9200. These are the four organizations that would be your primary points of contact. The APQC, ASQC, Benchmarking Exchange, and the Strategic Planning Institute. And you can see all four phone numbers there. If we drop back, you don't have a copy of this in your handouts, but Greg provided this to me, and so I thought maybe you'd like to see that so that you can make contacts as necessary. Okay, having said that, and with about 7 minutes left, and the fact that you devils out there have not bothered to call in and say hello and let us know how you're doing and how you're feeling, we'll just have to assume that you're feeling well and that you're looking forward to the next telecast next month when we have Dorian Shanin. But let's continue on in the few minutes that we have left and talk about a little more about benchmarking. There is a term that I've heard in connection with benchmarking. I think I know what it means, but I'm going to ask you to discuss it anyhow, and that's this principle of exchange. I think we've already really talked about it without using those words per se.
Yeah, the principle of exchange is one of the 9 principles in the benchmarking code of conduct that's jointly shared by APQC and the Strategic Planning Institute. The principle of exchange basically works on the idea of a quid pro quo, and this means a this for a that. Each organization is going to get something it deems valuable from the benchmarking study. Now, many times people will interpret this as, I will come to your organization, share with you my process, and you will share with me your process, and that's the extent of it. But sometimes when you want to learn from an organization who's the best, they don't care to find out from you. You might have another process that's more important to them that they'd rather hear about. So the idea is each organization gets something of value. Now, sometimes that something of value may just be the fact that an organization who is a leader in a process won't go out and benchmark it. They might not want to spend the time or the resources to do that. And the quid pro quo there may be that they get a copy of the report that shows where they stand relative to the industry and the lessons learned. So that's one, and if it's acceptable to both organizations, that's fine. Many times this is done with a third-party study where a consultant comes in because you want to blind the organizations. You don't want to specifically identify because the organizations are a little sensitive about their own performance data or the specific practices that they are using and just don't want it widely known what they're doing relative to other people.
Gotcha. Earlier we talked about some of the difficult things about doing a benchmarking study. What are some of the pitfalls that you can avoid when you first get started doing benchmarking? Just to kind of save them having to reinvent the wheel.
Well, I think the biggest one is really controlling, well, there are two. The biggest one, though, I think, is controlling who does what benchmarking study first. When I introduced benchmarking at one organization, it was a very empowered organization. Teams and process owners felt like they had the authority and responsibility to develop their own processes, to generate the improvements. And within a week, it seemed like there were 60 teams that said, we have to go benchmark. And clearly things got out of control very quickly because we couldn't support that with trained people. We couldn't support it with training. And it was a situation that just went amok. Now, a better solution is to do as Xerox had done and focus on 1, 2, maybe 3 studies that are going to make a difference so people become convinced this is the tool that works and we can use it. Some of the initial first studies that organizations tend to do are around customer satisfaction things. How do we build a process that really satisfies customers? It might be the telephone answering systems or the using a 1-800 number to improve your business. Another one is product development process, reducing costs or improving cycle time in manufacturing, and then focusing on a particular area where the improvement's needed. Well, that's one, I think, key startup point in terms of benchmarking.
Yeah.
Another one that comes to mind is don't train the whole organization in benchmarking.
Amen. That in every tool.
Right. When you have a team that's going to do benchmarking, train them in the process after they've defined the objective of the study. That way they can be clearly focused. They'll see perhaps a 12-step process. They'll learn how to do the research. And by clearly putting this within the context of what improvements they need to move, they might be able to come out with their study plan totally generated and understand what the next steps have to be. And you'll accelerate their learning process. So contexted learning is the only way to go.
I couldn't agree more. It's not just benchmarking. This whole concept of mass training, whether you're in continuous improvement or any concept for an organization where they're trying to help improve the organization, I just cannot believe the thousands, probably millions of dollars that have been wasted by many respected organizations in trying in good faith to improve their organizational performance and their organizational culture by mass training, just dropping the big bomb, the big load of information on everybody, and as a result virtually nobody learns, and by the time they're asked to try and implement the tool, you and I both know what happens. They've forgotten they've even taken the training, let alone what was in the training.
Yeah, the learning curve works against you in that case.
It really does. We've already talked about where our audience can get more information. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Is there any suggestions you'd like to make to the audience, either on where they can get more information about benchmarking in terms of books? We know about your books. We know about some of the other books. Any recommendations, last-minute thoughts about benchmarking and acquiring more information?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think when I first sit back and give the 30,000-foot perspective, that benchmarking really is about common sense. And it's about learning from other organizations. And I think a key that happens when people start becoming familiar with what benchmarking is they say, we've been doing elements of this in the past. And I think just by collecting some of those elements that you've been doing and showing management how they fit together, the improvements you've made, you've built a case for saying, we ought to try it. And just think about that as a beginning point and say, if it worked, and if it could work for Xerox to improve their business, it can work for us to improve our business.
Excellent. good words to close on. This has been Continuous Improvement with me, your host, Jack ReVelle, today's guest, Greg Watson, and we've been talking about benchmarking, and hopefully you've gained some additional insight and are thinking well about benchmarking. I'll see you next month when we talk with Dorian Shanin about statistical engineering. And with that, I say thank you, and we'll see you next month.